Hey everybody, Mike Toy with Bonsai Boise. There's one thing I have a lot of, it's ficus fusions. It's hard to tell where one ends and the next one begins in this grow tent right now. It's about mid-February. And I've got more than this too. I've got a few in bonsai pots and had even more last year. But in this video, we'll just take a look at the progress of maybe 6 or 7 of them. We'll take the tape off and just kind of see how they're coming along. And also here in a few minutes, I'll show you why I have so many fusions, and it wasn't really intentional initially. It just kind of happened, and you'll see why. But here's one of them. This is one that I tried numbering them at one point just so I could organize all the different videos that I've got on these. I kid you not, at one point I had about 20 different fusions going, and it was real hard to keep track of them all. So some are numbered, some are named, some the number wore off, so it's not super organized, but I'll try to do my best here. This is fusion number 1, and as you can see, I wrapped up the different branches and trunks in plumber's tape, just that silicone tape. Excuse me, not silicone, but Teflon tape, and then I wrapped wire around that. This was back in January of 24. And at this point, I think it was maybe a year old. And I just trimmed it up and I'm putting some fertilizer in. And then we're going to take this tape off here and get a good look at it. You can kind of see where the fusion is starting to happen there. But it does have some issues that will need to be addressed. Mainly what it is you've got the main trunk there on the left, and you've got 2 big branches, both coming out of basically the same spot. Fast forward a year, and let's see how the fusion is doing. So this is now January of 25. Initially, when I first started doing these, I would kind of let it just grow wild. And in theory, that's the right thing to do, because the more foliage a tree has, the more it thickens up. And when it's thickening up, it's fusing together because you got it all bound up. But I find that what's happening oftentimes was growth was happening in the wrong places. It was happening way up above where it was supposed to be fusing. So now I'm trying to keep that height down so that the growth has to happen right at that bottleneck where they're all fused, supposed to be fusing together. I find that's been working, and they look better and they're easier to maintain when they're smaller too. So a couple advantages. And I'll show you some other techniques I'm using for the fusion as well that I've been doing lately. So here's a closer look. This one's got kind of this flat iron thing going where it's sort of wide at one angle, and then you look at a different angle and it's really skinny. But you can see the fusion is definitely happening. There's some wiring scars from a couple years ago, I think it was. I posted an update video on a lot of these fusions about a year ago, and I'll put the link for that right here if you want to go back and see. There's still some gaps in there. I took the tape off one of the main branches. The problem with this branch is that there was no foliage. It was long and straight. And lo and behold, look at this. One of the branches died off completely, which ended up making my decision for this branch a lot easier. Because if you remember the 2 issues I had, 1, no foliage. It was this long, straight branch with no leaves. And 2, it was coming out of the same place as the trunk and another branch. So now when you look at it, you can see the one branch that's left is kind of awkward and just crisscrosses. So it was kind of an easy decision on what to do here. It wasn't even fused with anything. It was just separate and there's really nothing to do with it. So off it goes. We'll stick that in another fusion somewhere, someday, maybe. So that solves that problem. Actually cleaned it up a bit. Left a little bit of a gap just at the very bottom, but we can live with that. There is some foliage coming off of lower parts of that first main branch there, so we'll bring the height down on that later. So this one, I kind of did it a lazy way, and I just put some wire around. And the reason for that is that because of those two little branches at the bottom, it kind of makes it hard to wrap tape around there. I could have done it if I was really ambitious, but I'm trying different things with different trees, and so I'm just seeing how this goes with just wire. I don't usually do this. I usually do tape first. So much for fusion number 1. That's the update on that one. So let me show you where these come from. I have a habit of buying these big ficus trees off of Marketplace, and I mean big. Look at that. I've done that a few times. The primary goal is to make a bonsai tree out of, the stump of it. But sort of the byproduct of doing that is you get a whole bunch of cuttings. And, how many ficuses do you really need? So you got to do something with them. May as well try some fusions. And that's what I usually end up doing. So I'll grab a handful of the cuttings, clip all the little nubs off of there so that there's more surface area touching. Wrap them up in whatever way. Sometimes rubber bands, sometimes tape, sometimes strings, wire, who knows. Just whatever I got on hand. Some are little, some are big, like this. Sometimes I go straight into soil, but usually I'll soak them in water first and try to get them to root, or at least begin to root. I find that if you put them in water for the first 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a month, they will just begin to root, which is good enough. Here's an example of some that failed, and I'll show you how I handle that. So here we've got like 2 or 3 trunks in the middle of each one of these that died. And once that happens, it kind of messes it all up because now you got big gaps in there and it's just sort of goofy. There's a couple of big cuttings that died, unfortunately. So in this case, I just end up taking them all out of the pots. I unpot them. That's a term I just made up. So I unpot them and put them in some water. Give them a good soak, get something else ready. And now I'm going to consolidate what did survive out of those 3 failures into one mega fusion. Here's mega fusion. And this is still alive today, so it did survive. So not all is lost when you get some trunks that die off. And I don't always do it. Sometimes I just let it keep going as is. Sometimes it'll just be a little trunk that dies, and I'll just leave it in there because it's not worth taking apart and hassling with. But that's just one example of how I handle failures. Put it back on the bench. That was earlier this year, or earlier last year, I should say, in the summertime. And here it is on Christmas Day, actually. We were just sitting around watching a movie and I decided to check on it. So let's see how Mega Fusion is doing. At some point I put wire on there. It looks to me like that wire is starting to cut into the bark just from the way it's indented like that. And sure enough, it was. Wire is an interesting one. It will fuse these trees faster than any other method by far. But It will also cut into the bark. It'll cut right through that tape and everything and leave big wiring scars. But it seemed like it was started. It wasn't fused together, but they were at least fitting together. That's sort of the first stage, is when they kind of fit in like puzzle pieces. But I didn't see any actual fusion yet. Here's another one. So this is a different example where at some point last summer, I just put this into a bonsai pot. The branching was low enough on all the trunks, and yeah, I just thought we could do it. Here's the unveiling of this one. I do find that this Teflon tape has been doing some of this where it just kind of shreds a little bit. It didn't do that at first, but once it gets to be a year or so old, it starts to kind of fuse into the bark a little bit. So I'm getting away from that method. Here you can see the fusion is starting to happen there. It's a little bit past that initial stage of the puzzle piece thing, and it's actually fusing together. So I'm happy with the progress of this. It's not super pretty yet, but it will be someday. Got that one trunk in the front there that kind of zigzags like that. I think that will end up making a cool feature once it's all fused together. And I'll show you the newer method. I think we saw it briefly in one of the earlier trees there, but I'll show you the newer method that I'm doing and getting away from the Teflon tape. And it's just this clear plastic wrap. It's basically just the packing tape that you use. It's not adhesive. It's kind of like saran wrap that you would put over food. So I bought a couple of rolls from Amazon and I cut them in half so that they're more narrow. Now it's like 2 inches wide or so. And I use this whenever and wherever I can, because A, it's not as bold of a color and doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. You can still see it and it's not super pretty, but it's less ugly than that Teflon tape. Sort of transparent, so you can kind of see a little bit of what's going on in there. The downside is that it's wider, so 2 or 2.5 inches wide. So when I've got a tree that I don't have much space in there, I still use the Teflon tape. Yeah, so happy with the progress of this one. Back in the tent it will go for now, and we'll take a look at another. This one is fusion number 8. Let's take the tape off of this guy and see how it's doing. So the tape's been on this one for about a year. See how it kind of shredded like that? Yeah, it's a bummer. So this one did an interesting thing. I'll show you at the bottom here. Never seen one do this. But at the very bottom, right there, one of the trunks kind of just rotted away. Halfway. It just halfway rotted away. Now there's this sort of like weird gap there, or overhang. I don't know what you call it. I've never seen one do that, but this one did. Otherwise, I'd say the fusion is coming along. This one had a little bit less trunk height, I would call it. So one other thing I've learned is that, let's say you've got 8 inches of trunk and you tape it all up, all 8 inches. It'll take a much longer time for that to fuse together. Whereas if you have just a shorter bottleneck of like 3 inches right there, then think of the way, like if you're ever waiting in line and there's a bottleneck, it kind of works the same way. If you've got 2 or 3 long lines, you're not all bottlenecked, but if they all converge into one narrow spot, then that one spot becomes a cluster and it's a bottleneck. And that's what happens here. And that's what you want here. You want it to just all become a cluster in one spot so that it fuses together into one. Here's another method, by the way. So I wrap it in the packing tape, and then I've got this medical tubing, which is just for IVs, and I put the wire through the IV tubing first and then wrap it up. It's just as strong as it would be without the tubing, but I think it will reduce the wire marks. I think. Time will tell. I haven't been doing it long enough to know that for sure. Here's one that I named Frady's the Fusion. This is back in January of 24. Get a quick look at it here and then look at the progress. And by the way, I'll show you what some other more refined ones look like, some that are in bonsai pots. So first we'll look at what the Fusion looked like a year ago so that we can measure it compared to this year. Big unraveling here. So this time last year, it looks like it was still in that first phase of kind of fitting in like puzzle pieces. Wasn't really fused yet anywhere, at least that I'm seeing. So I wrapped it back up, put it back in the grow tent. And here it is a year later. I do pull these outside in the summertime, by the way. They don't stay in the grow tent year round. And I'm sure I've trimmed this up 2 or 3 times since then, if not more. So you can probably see that branch on the right. I'm definitely going to take that down, bring down the height as much as I can on these. Sort of a mess down there. I'm trying to fill in the gap. If you notice that gap down in the middle, in the center, there's a gap in the trunks, and I'm trying to fill that in. Not been super successful doing it yet. So I trimmed it all up, brought the height down on some of those branches as much as I could. Got some cuttings, because I definitely need more ficus cuttings. Obviously. I've got other experiments that'll be covered in another video. So I wired that branch down and get a little movement since it was just going straight up. Now let's take a look at this Fusion here. It looks once again like the wires are cutting into the bark. Just judging by the indent there, and they were. You see it. So the fusion is starting to happen. If you remember what it looked like a year ago, it was in that first phase of puzzle pieces. Now it's starting to fuse together. Not everywhere. Still some gaps there. There's one there. But there is fusion happening. And it looks like the fusion is happening around that one little branch down there, so that might work, closing the gap there, sticking that little cutting in. So that's good. So wrap it up in packaging tape. And the same trick with the wire in the medical tubing. Eventually it does just kind of start happening on its own, even without tape or wire or anything. But it's got to be pretty good and fused by then. And this is where I left it. So back in the grow tent it goes. And we'll take a look at another one that's out already in a bonsai pot. So here's one as of last October, October 24. It was in a bonsai. I put it in a bonsai pot. I think I just got a wild hair one day and just did it. I thought it looked all right. It wasn't super fused yet, but the foliage situation was good enough. And here it is as of just yesterday. Pulled it out, trimmed it up, and then we'll take a look at this fusion situation and see how it's coming along. I did a few tricks there. Had some branches that were kind of going rogue, and just the way it was shaped, it allowed me to sort of wrap it around another branch. Because why not? That's the fun thing about these fusions, is you can kind of just play around with them a little bit and experiment with different things. Some things work, some things don't. And that's okay. I'd say we're, I don't know, maybe the first stage of the puzzle piece thing. Maybe it looks like there might be some fusion happening. Not there, but the other side. A little bit, maybe. I don't know. It's a stage 1.5. But I do like its progress so far. I think it's coming along. There's no real obvious issues that I'm going to have to deal with. I may get rid of that one low branch, but not yet. I'd say all in all, this one's looking good. It's on its way. So wrap it back up. I thought about not wrapping it in wire, but I happen to have a little piece just sitting there, so why not? It's just, you really got to keep an eye on it with wire. With just the tape, you can kind of get away with not checking on it so often. Maybe the tape will eventually cut into the bark, I'm not sure. But the wire certainly will, in very little time too, especially in the growing season. That's why I left that one. So that's about all the updates for today. It was kind of a longer video than I normally do, but I wanted to get a good broad view of them all. So I appreciate you watching. Please like and subscribe. Let me know any tips and tricks that you use. Vet tape is something I'm going to be using next, so look for a video on that later. Thanks again. Have a good rest of your day.